The 1920s are a fascinating period in British history because I think society is still reeling from the impact of the Great War, which had ended in 1918. A generation had vanished, and Britain was still more or less in mourning from this experience. But it was also a period of fantastically swift social change, where great advances in women's rights, for instance, were secured. A very febrile time politically too, a lot of activism. So uncertain times, but times when people are really embracing cinema. This is a time when cinema is a fantastically popular activity.
There was probably about 20 million people went to the cinema every week, or there were 20 million admissions because the cinemas were so popular. The programme changed twice a week. Every 3 days there'd be a new film on at the cinema. And this is in a population of 45 million. So a huge number of people went.
The idea of the purpose-built cinema is very, very new. And actually one of the reasons why those buildings begin to spring up in the 1920s is because exhibitors, the people who show the films, want to draw in that new audience, and they want to give them somewhere nice to sit. The idea that you came in off the boring street and into this kind of fairyland where you were transported to another world, that was what they were selling to you, really. So that idea of it being transporting and exotic too was very important.
The programme would run for about 3 hours perhaps, and you'd have your main film, but there would be smaller items within the show. You'd have comic items which are very short, you'd have newsreels, you'd have sort of travelogue films, short items. You would even have quite often people performing song and dance routines as part of the evening's entertainment. The cinemas replaced live entertainment to a degree, and the bands, which would vary from cinema to cinema, I think people would partly go for that.
British filmmakers had a bit of a fight on their hands in the 20s because Hollywood dominated the exhibition circuit, and this is really where our love affair with Hollywood truly begins. We still think of film as something that really by and large comes from America. The tastes of American cinema still shape the taste of the rest of the world. And this is something that really began to take root in this country in the 1920s. It was hard to get British films into those screens because the producers of Hollywood product made sure that that was very, very difficult. So by the end of the 20s, the business had got its thoughts together and had met with government to try and work out what could be done about this. And the answer was the 1927 Cinematograph Act, which meant that a certain number of screens, a certain number of performances had to be reserved for showing British films. And also, vast stages were built, and really there was a tremendous amount of production. High quality, very sophisticated, rather expensive production by the end of the 1920s. And Alfred Hitchcock was one of the prime movers in all of that.
Hitchcock joined the industry when he was about 21 as someone who designed the title cards, which were shown in silent films. But he learnt all of the other skills involved in filmmaking from American professionals who'd been in the business a while. And so when his studio was taken over by the producer Michael Balcon, who was barely older than Hitchcock, he was noticed as someone with talent and someone who was very ambitious. And the film critic Caroline Lejeune, who met him in these years, said you could tell that Hitchcock was someone who was going to rise through the ranks very quickly, and he did. He was 25 years old when he made his first film.
He had a kind of intellectual interest in cinema as well. He was a bit of a theorist, and he thought very hard about all aspects of it, really, particularly about questions like where to put the camera, about how to edit film to make these images more suspenseful, more exciting. He was very interested in European cinema too, and absorbed a lot of influence from German films that he was particularly clued into.
But because there'd been the war against Germany, British exhibitors boycotted German films, but eventually they started to come in, and they had an enormous effect on film culture in the 1920s. Film critics were crazy about them, and Hitchcock was crazy about them. films like Fritz Lang's Destiny, which was shown in the cinema we're standing in right now, the Polytechnic. When Hitchcock's first film came out, he was promoted as Britain's youngest director, and the film critics were all in favour of the film. They found the story slightly distasteful, but he was clearly very talented and had a sort of a distinctive style of his own. And this reputation only increased over the years. But within a few weeks of his first film being shown to the trade, he was given a £10,000 contract by a new company, British International Pictures, which was unprecedented in British cinema. So he was a well-known name decades before he was discovered as the great auteur, Alfred Hitchcock.